Hello, everyone, and welcome to Module 1, Climate Finance Fundamentals, under the Learning Series Climate Finance 101, Fundamentals, Architecture, and Risk-Informed Financing Pathways. This opening module establishes the foundation for the entire learning series. Climate finance is now one of the most important areas of global climate action. It connects international cooperation, national development planning, public finance, private investment, disaster risk reduction, humanitarian preparedness, social protection, and climate justice. At the same time, climate finance can appear complex. Different institutions use different terms. Finance may come through grants, loans, guarantees, equity, bonds, insurance, technical assistance, budget support, or pre-arranged financing instruments. It may be public or private, domestic or international, concessional or commercial, and directed toward mitigation, adaptation, resilience, or cross-cutting outcomes. The purpose of this module is therefore simple: to build a clear, practical understanding of what climate finance is, why it matters, how it is structured, and how it can support risk-informed and early action approaches. Before we begin, we acknowledge the technical experts, reviewers, advisors, and partner institutions who contributed to the development of this module. The climate finance landscape is broad and constantly evolving. This module does not attempt to cover every fund, instrument, actor, or financing modality. Rather, it provides a structured entry point into selected foundational concepts that are most relevant for introductory learning and practical application. As we move through the module, I invite you to think not only about finance as money, but also as a system of decisions: who provides finance, who receives it, on what terms, for what purpose, and at what point in the risk cycle. This module is organized into 7 sections. First, we will begin with why climate finance matters. We will examine the changing climate risk context and the growing gap between climate finance needs and available flows. Second, we will discuss the definition, scope, and core categories of climate finance. Third, we will distinguish climate finance from related financing domains. Fourth, we will place climate finance within the global governance architecture. Fifth, we will discuss climate justice, with attention to equity, access, affordability, adequacy, and quality of finance. Sixth, we will look at an illustrative country case from the Philippines to see how these concepts appear in practice. Finally, we will close with a short reflection and knowledge check. We begin with a central question: why does climate finance matter? Climate change is no longer only an environmental issue. It is reshaping development risk. It is making crises more predictable, but also more frequent and harder to recover from. It affects sectors including infrastructure, agriculture, water security, health systems, migration, food systems, public budgets, social protection, and livelihoods. For developing countries, this challenge is especially unequal. Many have contributed least to historical emissions, yet face some of the most severe impacts. They often have less fiscal space to invest in preparedness and recovery, and greater barriers to accessing finance at the speed and scale required. Climate finance is therefore central to implementing national climate commitments, strengthening resilience, preparing for crises, supporting timely response, and safeguarding development gains. It is also where early action financing becomes relevant. If climate and disaster risks are becoming more predictable in some contexts, finance must increasingly be arranged before impacts fully unfold. This slide presents 4 indicators of a changing climate system: rising carbon dioxide concentrations, rising global temperatures, rising global mean sea level, and increasing ocean heat content. These are not isolated scientific indicators. They are signals of growing financial, institutional, and social risk. Can you all think about the implications of all these 4 indicators? Well, to list a few: rising greenhouse gas concentrations drive global warming. Higher temperatures intensify heat extremes and affect rainfall patterns. Sea level rise increases risks for coastal infrastructure, low-lying cities, and island communities. Ocean warming affects marine ecosystems, fisheries, storms, and long-term climate stability. The previous slide showed long-term climate trends. This slide shows how those trends are expressed unevenly across regions and systems. Some areas are becoming hotter or drier. Others are experiencing intense rainfall, floods, storms, or compound hazards. These physical impacts interact with poverty, food insecurity, displacement, fragile infrastructure, and fiscal stress. Natural hazard-related disasters affect millions of people, damage assets, disrupt livelihoods, and increase pressure on humanitarian and public finance systems. If finance arrives only after damages occur, it may support response and recovery, but it often arrives too late to prevent avoidable losses. Risk-informed finance, including pre-arranged and early action finance, can help shift systems from reactive crisis response toward anticipatory risk management. This slide highlights the widening gap between climate finance needs and available support. Developing countries require finance at a scale far greater than current flows. It is noted that developing countries would need about $1.1 trillion in climate finance from 2025, rising to around $1.8 trillion by 2030. Further, the United Nations Environment Programme UNEP's Adaptation Gap Report 2025 estimates that adaptation finance needs in developing countries are about $310 billion per year by 2035 based on modeled costs, and $365 billion per year when extrapolated from needs expressed in nationally determined contributions, NDCs, and national adaptation plans, NAPs. By contrast, international public adaptation finance flows to developing countries were $26 billion in 2023, down from $28 billion in 2022. This tells us that needs are rising faster than support. Having established why climate finance matters, we now turn to a more technical but essential question: what do we mean by climate finance? This section introduces the building blocks, sources, uses, categories, channels, and terms of finance. This slide presents the core definition of climate finance. Climate finance refers to local, national, or transnational financing drawn from public, private, and alternative sources to address climate change. This includes finance to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, adapt to adverse climate impacts, and reduce climate-related impacts. There are three important dimensions in this definition. The first is source. Climate finance may come from public budgets, multilateral climate funds, development banks, bilateral agencies, private investors, commercial banks, households, philanthropic organizations, or innovative instruments. The second is purpose. Climate finance must support climate objectives, including mitigation, adaptation, resilience, risk reduction, or cross-cutting outcomes. The third is scale and direction. Finance may be domestic or international. It may flow within a country, across borders, through public institutions, through markets, or through blended arrangements. Increasingly, climate finance is also expected to support risk-informed systems. This means finance should not only repair losses after climate impacts occur. It should also reduce vulnerability, strengthen preparedness, improve early warning, and enable timely action before forecasted shocks become disasters. This slide introduces the core categories of climate finance. First, finance may support mitigation, adaptation, or dual benefit outcomes. Mitigation finance reduces or limits emissions or enhances sinks. Adaptation finance reduces vulnerability and builds resilience. Dual benefit finance contributes to both. Second, finance may be public or private. Public finance comes from governments, public institutions, multilateral development banks, bilateral agencies, development finance institutions, and multilateral climate funds. Private finance comes from commercial banks, corporations, institutional investors, project developers, households, and market actors. Third, finance may be international or domestic. International climate finance is raised in one country and spent in another. Domestic climate finance is raised and spent within the same country. Fourth, finance may be concessional or commercial. Concessional finance is provided on more generous terms than market finance, including grants or below-market loans. Commercial finance is provided on market-based terms. Public climate finance remains essential, particularly for adaptation, resilience, public goods, institutional strengthening, data systems, early warning, policy reform, and support to vulnerable communities. This slide highlights 4 major channels. First, multilateral climate funds, such as the Green Climate Fund, Global Environment Facility, Adaptation Fund, and Climate Investment Funds. Second, multilateral development banks, such as the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, African Development Bank, and others. Third, bilateral agencies, such as JICA and GIZ, provide country-to-country support. Fourth, national and subnational government budgets are critical. Public finance often plays a foundational role because it can support areas where commercial returns are limited but social benefits are high. This is particularly relevant for early warning systems, preparedness, and early action systems. Private climate finance includes investments from corporations, financial institutions, project developers, venture capitalists, households, and capital markets. This may include foreign direct investment in renewable energy, sustainable agriculture, and infrastructure, green and sustainability bonds, equity investment, venture capital, private equity, carbon markets, and emissions trading systems. Private finance is crucial for scaling climate action, especially where revenue streams are clear and commercial returns are possible. However, private finance does not automatically flow to the areas of greatest vulnerability. It usually follows contexts where risks are manageable, regulations are clear, markets are mature, and returns are sufficient. This slide shifts from definitions to actual flows. It shows the public and private composition of climate finance in 2023. The key point is that global climate finance has grown, but its distribution remains uneven. Private finance often dominates in regions with mature markets and stronger investment environments. Public finance remains especially important in regions where risks are higher, markets are shallower, and investment conditions are more constrained. For participants, a useful question is, when we say climate finance is increasing, who is receiving it, who is providing it, and what type of finance is being counted? This matters because the growth of global climate finance does not automatically mean that vulnerable countries, adaptation priorities, or early action systems are receiving adequate support. This slide adds another layer: whether climate finance is raised domestically or internationally. In many higher income or larger economies, climate finance is predominantly domestic. In more vulnerable and lower income regions, international finance can play a much larger role. The message is that climate finance is unequal not only in volume, but also in structure. Regions with stronger economies can mobilize more domestic and private finance. More vulnerable regions often depend on international public and concessional finance. This raises a justice question: how can international climate finance better reach countries and communities that face high risk but have limited capacity to mobilize finance domestically? This slide provides a useful way to think about climate finance across the risk and resilience continuum: upstream, midstream, and downstream finance. Upstream financing refers to long-term investment for resilience, adaptation, and structural transformation. Examples include resilient infrastructure, ecosystem restoration, climate-smart agriculture, energy transition, and urban resilience. These investments reduce underlying risk over time. Midstream financing strengthens preparedness and implementation capacity. Examples include hydrometeorological systems, early warning, social protection systems, contingency planning, public financial management, data systems, and risk analytics. This layer improves anticipatory and absorptive capacity. Downstream financing supports shock response and prearranged finance that can be dispersed rapidly when triggers are met or crises unfold. Examples include insurance, contingent credit, forecast-based financing, anticipatory action windows, scalable social protection, reserve funds, and risk pools. The important message is that these layers are complementary. Upstream finance reduces risk. Midstream finance strengthens systems. Downstream finance protects lives, livelihoods, and earlier investments when shocks occur. We now move from the internal categories of climate finance to its relationship with other financing domains. In practice, climate finance does not operate in isolation. It overlaps with development finance, humanitarian finance, social protection financing, sustainable finance, green finance, disaster risk reduction finance, and early action finance. Understanding these overlaps improves coordination and helps countries build more coherent financing strategies. It also helps us situate early action finance, not as a separate universe, but as an approach that connects climate information, disaster risk management, humanitarian preparedness, social protection, and resilience building. This slide introduces several related financing domains. Development finance supports development goals that improve people's lives, economies, societies, and the environment. Humanitarian finance saves lives, protects dignity, and meets urgent needs during and after crises. Social protection financing supports programs that help people cope with poverty, vulnerability, exclusion, and life cycle risks. Sustainable finance supports long-term economic, social, and environmental sustainability and contributes to the Sustainable Development Goals. Green finance supports activities and investments that deliver environmental benefits, such as cleaner energy, pollution reduction, biodiversity protection, and sustainable resource use. Climate finance supports action on climate change, including mitigation, adaptation, resilience, and the reduction of climate impacts. Disaster risk reduction finance supports efforts to prevent, reduce, and manage disaster risks before disasters occur, including preparedness, resilient infrastructure, early warning, and risk-informed planning. Early action financing refers to finance released before or immediately after a forecasted shock so that early measures can reduce impacts on people, assets, and systems. Do you notice any overlaps among them through their definitions? This slide shows that these domains are distinct, yet deeply connected. In practice, a single intervention may sit at the intersection of several domains. For example, forecast-based cash assistance before a cyclone may involve humanitarian finance, social protection delivery systems, disaster risk reduction planning, climate information, and early action finance. A climate-resilient agriculture program may combine development finance, climate adaptation finance, private investment, and social protection measures. The purpose of this slide is to encourage systems thinking. Climate finance should not be designed in silos. Early action finance is especially important here because it can serve as a bridge between long-term climate resilience and immediate crisis prevention. Early action financing is prearranged, predictable, and timely financing that supports anticipatory action and early response. It enables action before, during, or immediately after the onset of a forecasted or emerging crisis. Several elements are important. First, finance is arranged in advance. This means institutions do not begin fundraising only after a crisis has escalated. Second, finance is linked to risk information, forecasts, triggers, or thresholds. Third, finance supports pre-agreed actions, such as cash transfers, evacuation support, livestock protection, pre-positioning of supplies, health measures, water provision, or other protective measures. Fourth, the objective is to reduce impacts before they become worse. A reflective question for participants is, in your context, what hazards are predictable enough for early action, and what financing arrangements would be needed before the next shock occurs? This slide highlights the benefits of ex-ante or proactive financing. Traditionally, much disaster-related finance has been mobilized after impacts occur. Governments reallocate budgets, humanitarian agencies launch appeals, and donors provide emergency support. These mechanisms remain important, but they often come after people have already lost assets, livelihoods, homes, or access to basic services. Ex-ante financing changes this sequence. It enables action before a shock escalates. It improves speed and timeliness because finance and action plans are arranged in advance. It can reduce response costs and losses by preventing avoidable harm. This slide shows that different institutions use different terms or concepts, including finance for early action, anticipatory action, forecast-based financing, early action protocols, simplified early action protocols, and the anticipatory pillar of IFRC DRF. Although terminology varies, several common elements appear across these approaches. First, there is risk information, often in the form of forecasts, vulnerability analysis, risk modeling, or impact-based warnings. Second, there are pre-agreed triggers or thresholds. These determine when finance should be released or when action should begin. Third, there are pre-agreed actions. These identify what will be done, by whom, and for whom. Fourth, there is pre-arranged finance, so resources are available when the trigger is reached. We now place climate finance within the wider global governance architecture. Climate finance is not only a technical financing issue. It is also connected to international commitments under the UNFCCC, the Paris Agreement, multilateral climate funds, transparency arrangements, and negotiations around equity, responsibility, adequacy, and access. Early action financing has also gained greater relevance within this wider architecture, especially through increasing attention to early warning systems, pre-arranged finance, disaster risk finance, anticipatory action, and loss and damage. This slide shows how climate finance has evolved through COP decisions. At COP13 in Bali, climate finance gained prominence through discussions on financial resources and investment for mitigation and adaptation. At COP15 in Copenhagen, developed countries agreed to mobilize $100 billion per year by 2020. At COP16 in Cancun, the Green Climate Fund was established. The Paris Agreement at COP21 marked a turning point by linking finance to NDCs, mitigation, adaptation, and long-term climate-resilient development. Subsequent COPs increasingly elevated adaptation finance, climate risk insurance, loss and damage, the Global Goal on Adaptation, and the new Collective Quantified Goal. This slide highlights three important Paris Agreement provisions. Article 9 reaffirms that developed countries shall provide financial resources to assist developing countries with mitigation and adaptation. Article 2.1c broadens the agenda by calling for finance flows to be made consistent with low greenhouse gas emissions and climate-resilient development. Article 13 establishes the enhanced transparency framework, including clarity on support provided and received. This slide highlights how recent COP outcomes are moving the climate finance agenda from broad commitments toward implementation, scale, and delivery. First, COP30 advanced the implementation of the finance commitment agreed under the new Collective Quantified Goal. The COP29 decision set a goal of at least $300 billion per year by 2035 for developing countries, with developed countries taking the lead, and called on all actors to work toward scaling finance to at least $1.3 trillion per year by 2035 from public and private sources. Second, COP30 carried forward the Baku to Belém roadmap to $1.3 trillion, which focuses on scaling finance for developing countries to support low-emission, climate-resilient development and implementation of NDCs and NAPs. Importantly, this roadmap also recognizes the need for grants, concessional and non-debt creating instruments, and measures that create fiscal space. Third, adaptation finance received stronger political attention. Parties agreed to call for efforts to at least triple adaptation finance by 2035 within the NCQG framework. However, the outcome remains diplomatically sensitive because many developing countries and civil society actors had called for stronger timelines, clearer baselines, and more predictable grant-based delivery. Fourth, the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage moved further toward operational delivery. The operationalization of the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage marks a significant evolution of climate finance beyond mitigation and adaptation, toward addressing the unavoidable impacts of climate change. Its Barbados implementation modalities launched the first call for funding requests at COP30, with an initial $250 million funding window. This is an important step, but the available amount remains modest compared with the scale of climate-related loss and damage faced by vulnerable countries. This slide shifts from climate finance milestones to early action financing milestones. The foundations were built over decades through meteorological services, early warning systems, famine early warning, and disaster risk reduction frameworks. Between 2008 and 2013, Red Cross and Red Crescent actors, the World Food Programme, and partners began testing forecast-based approaches and linking forecasts to humanitarian action. From 2015 to 2020, anticipatory action became more institutionalized through the Sendai Framework, CRUISE, Forecast-Based Financing Pilots, IFRC Drift's Anticipatory Pillar, REAP, OCHA Surf Pilots, and the Anticipation Hub. From 2022 onwards, COP27 and COP28 elevated early warning, prearranged risk finance, the Global Shield, and loss and damage finance. Early action finance was not created by one institution or one COP. It emerged from operational practice, humanitarian learning, disaster risk reduction, and climate risk governance. COP21 in Paris was important because of the launch of CRUISE and stronger attention to early warning systems. COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh was significant because of early warnings for all, the Global Shield against climate risks, and the decision to establish funding arrangements for loss and damage. COP28 in Dubai was important for operationalizing the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage and strengthening the wider climate impact finance architecture. We now move to one of the most important dimensions of climate finance, justice. Countries and communities have contributed differently to climate change. They also have different capacities to respond. Many of those facing the highest risks have contributed least to the problem and have the least fiscal space to finance adaptation, preparedness, early action, and recovery. This means climate finance must be assessed not only by how much is mobilized, but by whether it is adequate, accessible, affordable, predictable, non-debt inducing where appropriate, and responsive to vulnerable people and ecosystems. Developing countries face adaptation finance needs estimated in the hundreds of billions of dollars annually by 2035, while international public adaptation finance flows remain far below that level. This gap has strong equity implications. Those most exposed to climate impacts often have the least capacity to finance adaptation at scale. They may face limited fiscal space, high debt burdens, weak access to capital markets, and limited institutional capacity to prepare large climate finance proposals. For early action, this matters because the capacity to act before a shock depends on whether finance is already available, whether delivery systems are ready, and whether vulnerable communities are reached in time. This slide shows that climate finance is geographically concentrated. From 2018 to 2023, a large share of global climate finance was mobilized in three regions: East Asia and the Pacific, Western Europe, and the United States and Canada. China dominated flows within East Asia and the Pacific. This also tells us that climate finance does not automatically reach the places of highest vulnerability. It often concentrates where markets are large, domestic finance is available, and private investment conditions are favorable. Targeted international public and concessional finance, therefore, remains essential for underfinanced regions, especially for adaptation, resilience, early warning, and early action systems where commercial finance is less likely to flow on its own. Also, it is essential to create favorable conditions to mobilize private investments. This slide brings the equity discussion into the early action finance space. International prearranged financing reached an all-time high in 2024. This is encouraging because it shows that more financial coverage is being arranged in advance for countries and humanitarian agencies. However, we invite you to look carefully at what is being measured. International prearranged financing reflects the maximum funding that could be available if instruments are triggered. It is a measure of potential coverage, not always actual payouts. This distinction matters. Coverage is important, but vulnerable countries and communities ultimately need timely, usable resources when risk thresholds are reached. Even when prearranged financing grows, equity gaps can remain. Some countries may have greater access to insurance, risk pools, contingent credit, or donor-supported instruments. Others, especially low-income countries, fragile and conflict-affected situations, and some highly vulnerable groups, may remain undercovered. The slide also distinguishes between different ways of tracking prearranged finance: potential coverage, actual payouts, and development partner support for prearranged finance. These distinctions are important because they tell different stories. A reflective question here is success measured by how much finance is theoretically available, or by whether vulnerable people actually receive timely support before impacts escalate? The graphs show the differential payouts received by different regions and trigger events. Participants are encouraged to reflect upon the possible reasons for these differences. The existence of funds does not automatically translate into access. Access depends on national readiness, institutional capacity, project preparation systems, fiduciary standards, safeguards, data, coordination arrangements, and the ability to develop credible pipelines. For climate finance to be effective, it must be predictable, accessible, affordable, non-debt inducing where appropriate, and adequate. What do you think? Can the same parameters be considered for access to early action financing? The same parameters can also be considered for early action financing. Early action finance must be predictable enough to plan around, accessible enough to use quickly, affordable enough not to worsen fiscal stress, adequate enough to meet needs, and structured in a way that does not create harmful debt burdens for vulnerable countries. This slide highlights the quality of finance. Effective climate finance must do no harm. It should avoid negative social, environmental, or institutional consequences. It must also avoid maladaptation, meaning that interventions should not unintentionally increase long-term vulnerability or create new risks. Climate finance should be built for continuity. It should be compatible with national systems, infrastructure, governance arrangements, and local capacities. It should consider maintenance, operating costs, and institutional ownership beyond the project cycle. Consider the examples. Weather stations should be compatible with national observation networks. Digital systems should be interoperable and maintainable. Project finance should include operation and maintenance costs, not only installation. Climate investments should strengthen existing institutions rather than create parallel systems. For early action financing, this means that triggers, protocols, delivery systems, and financing mechanisms should be institutionalized, tested, and maintained, not treated as one-off crisis instruments. We now bring the module together through an illustrative country case. The purpose of the case study is not to present a full assessment of all climate finance flows. Rather, it helps us apply the concepts introduced earlier: scale, source, instrument, theme, sector, terms, access, and early action relevance. This slide applies the module's concepts to the Philippines, a country with high exposure to climate and disaster risks and significant financing needs for adaptation, mitigation, and resilience. The Philippines' NDC implementation requirement is estimated at around $72 billion. Between 2016 and 2022, the country received about $15.9 billion in international climate-related development finance. However, the composition matters. Around $14.91 billion came through debt instruments, while around $0.96 billion came as grants. By theme, adaptation received $6.55 billion, mitigation $5.10 billion, and dual benefit finance $4.25 billion. Japan was the largest financier, including substantial concessional loans. Sectorally, transport and storage dominated allocations, while disaster management received a notable adaptation allocation. This slide shows that the Philippines' climate finance landscape is a portfolio of mechanisms, not a single stream of funding. Under UNFCCC-related mechanisms, the Green Climate Fund's SAP-010 supports multi-hazard impact-based forecasting, early warning systems, and forecast-based early action through grant finance and co-financing. The Adaptation Fund's Tawi-Tawi project supports water-energy food nexus adaptation. Multilateral Development Bank examples include the World Bank's DRM and ClimateCat DDO, which provides contingent credit for quick drawdown after a state of calamity, and ADB financing for flood resilience, adaptation, climate governance, and low-carbon pathways. Bilateral examples include JICA support through concessional loans for climate change action and flood control, including non-structural measures such as hazard maps and capacity support. The early action-related examples are particularly important. SURF support linked to anticipatory action and technical cooperation for hydrometeorological capacity shows how early warning, readiness, and finance can work together. This module has introduced the foundations of climate finance. First, climate finance is central to global climate action because it connects mitigation, adaptation, resilience, disaster risk reduction, social protection, development planning, and climate justice. Second, climate finance is not only about the amount of money mobilized. It is also about the source, purpose, terms, accessibility, predictability, and quality of finance. Third, climate finance can be public or private, domestic or international, concessional or commercial, and directed toward mitigation, adaptation, or cross-cutting outcomes. Fourth, public climate finance remains especially important for adaptation, resilience, early warning, preparedness, and support to vulnerable countries and communities, where commercial returns may be limited. Fifth, early action financing helps shift systems from delayed response to anticipatory risk management by linking forecasts, triggers, pre-arranged finance, and pre-agreed actions. Sixth, climate finance has a strong justice dimension. It must respond to unequal vulnerability, unequal responsibility, unequal fiscal capacity, and unequal access to finance. Finally, the main takeaway from this module is that climate finance should be understood not only as funding, but as a system for enabling climate resilient, low emission, inclusive, and risk-informed development. Thank you for your participation and engagement.